Aura is a project about what lives in the messes that we've made of late, and it's a project that requires imagination and curiosity in both the humanities and the sciences, and a new kind of dialogue between the arts and the sciences. Scott Gilbert and Donna Haraway show us the way in this dialogue, and I think they show us some of the kinds of symbiosis that we've been discussing this morning, building from each other's research. They each have developed new fields that could not exist without the entanglement of the other. Donna Haraway is a distinguished professor emerita in the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California at Santa Cruz. She's a very much beloved colleague of mine there, and we have also had the wonderful chance to teach together. She has the quality of being able to sponsor both local and wide-ranging intellectual excitement, as I think you can tell by this full auditorium here. I thought to begin to introduce her, I would mention just some of the names of just a few of her books, which show the imagination with which she uses language to draw us into other worlds, other ways of knowing, practicing the SF that she speaks of, speculative fabulation, science fiction string figures, and much more. Here's a few. Crystals, Fabrics, and Fields, Metaphors of Organicism in 20th Century Developmental Biology. Primate Visions, Gender, Race, and Nature in the World of Modern Science. Modest Witnessed at Second Millennium, Female Man Copyright Meets Oncomouse, Trademark, Feminism, and Technoscience. And When Species Meet. I also thought I'd mention two very influential manifestos that she's written. The first, A Cyborg Manifesto, Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the Late 20th Century. And the second, The Companion Species Manifesto, Dogs, People, and Significant Otherness. Professor Haraway received her PhD in biology from Yale under Evelyn Hutchinson. And I mention this not just as a list of criterion, but because it allowed her to help to pioneer a new kind of science studies than had existed before, where the earliest stirrings of science studies were a kind of critique of science's ideology. What Professor Haraway brings to us was the ability to think from inside the sciences to also look at critical histories. So it allowed us it gave many of us permission to look at both words and worlds together, you could say, to both look at the kinds of discourses, histories of meaning, and kind of the human entanglements, and also to look at what it is that the scientists had been so interested in. So a new field was born. At that time, too, Professor Haraway, who was a pioneer in an emerging feminist theory, this feminist theory was not only asking, where are the women, but also taking a second look at that famous Enlightenment figure, man with a capital M, who was supposed to be a generic and neutral figure with no class, race, or gender, no nationality, no religion, who could stand above the world and look at, and understand and control the world without any entanglement in the world. That figure of the Enlightenment, which had sponsored so much of the academy as we know, was something that Professor Haraway and her colleagues allowed us to think about again in a critical way. Instead of detachment as the way that knowledge was constructed, she suggested that all knowledge is situated. It's situated in several kinds of apparatuses, not only the close apparatuses of the scientific experiment or the laboratory, but also the not quite so close apparatuses that make science possible in the way it is at particular times and places. In some ways, for the scientists who are in the room, you could think about this as the same kind of attention as makes us put a materials and methods section in any scientific article, that we wouldn't consider it to be very good science if we left the materials and methods out. So the call for situated knowledges is a very similar call for a more precise specification of how is it that we know anything. But we've had the bad habit of, even when we put a materials and methods section in our articles, we still abstract those knowledges and make them appear as if without the apparatus in which they appeared, they were somehow also had some kind of transcendent truth. And it's that claim that Donna Haraway has challenged to show us new kinds of knowledge that must always be situated at many different levels. Put that together with her curiosity about both words and worlds, and you get her newest research on new multi-species practices of curiosity. Curiosity in which the contact zone between humans and other species is a place of emergent materialities and sensibilities. This is a place for all of us, humanists, artists, scientists, to explore. And I think, just as with Professor Gilbert's work, it's created a radical new kind of knowledge making in and out of the academy. It's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Donna Haraway.
Thank you. Well, while I'm getting my microphone, I will say that I am inspired by dog cartoons in my materials and methods section. And I am remembering in particular the wonderful Sidney Harris cartoon based on Leonardo da Vinci's Man of Perfect Proportions. And it's the dog of perfect proportions. It's the dog with its four limbs standing as the Renaissance man of perfect proportions, defined by the ratios of the Fibonacci series that in some sense inspire my work. Anna and I taught a triptych of graduate seminars together where we put our anthropology graduate students and our history of consciousness graduate students together in the same room and called it geofeminisms in this effort to explore what counts as worldliness. Now, you should know that the name history of consciousness, which probably derives mostly from the German Wissenschaften tradition more than anything else in the naming, nonetheless, we admitted graduate students who, if they claimed to understand what the subject was, they did not get in on the ground of literal mindedness. Because if we, the faculty, had not a clue what the history of consciousness was, we were highly suspicious of applicants who claimed to have a lock on consciousness. So in a way, it's a signifier for that collection of people and problems that need an ecology that might be called transdisciplinary, but that would be misleading too. It's rather more a group of people who are driven by questions that require a kind of composing and decomposing of the skills for investigating them and require the help of our friends at every step of the game. So the notion of sympoiesis, that kind of making with, rather than autopoiesis, a kind of self-organization of making, the notion of the poem as an autopoetic aesthetic act, or of the organism as an autopoetic self-construction of a complex, multi-layered system. That kind of notion, at the level of the pragmatics of work practice, never made much sense. Sympoiesis, the making with, the sympoetic critters. And Scott proposed to us one of the renamings of sympoetic critters in terms of the holobiont and the holobiome, and the kind of creative and generative work that these renamings open up. And I would like to point out also in my introduction that Scott and I were students together, really, at the Johns Hopkins University in the early 1970s. I was a baby faculty member in the history of science who knew nothing about the history of science because I came out of biology. And so my colleagues assigned me to teach the introductory graduate theory and methods courses to history of science graduate students like Finn Osrud, the head of the Niels Bohr Archive, who's here in the room with us, who was one of the first graduate students with whom I learned history of science, and Scott, who was doing a master's thesis in history of biology, for which I was the titular advisor. Fact was, all I had to do was sign the papers. And who took seminars in the history of biology, and simultaneously, as a biology PhD student in molecular and cell and developmental biology, was setting up a practicum for the history of science students in his laboratory, so that folks would kind of move down move to the other building with Scott for kind of hands-on jouissance in the embryo, a kind of a trading zone, a sympoiesis of practices that were both very corporeal, very embodied, and very much about developing the cognitive skills of somehow getting on together. So I begin then this overwrought lecture, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Chthulucene, making string figures with biologies, arts, activisms, this way. What happens when human exceptionalism and methodological individualism, those old saws of Western philosophy and political economics, and I would add biology, became unthinkable in the best sciences, whether natural or social? Seriously unthinkable, not available to think with. Biological sciences have been especially potent in fermenting the notions about all the mortal inhabitants of the earth since the imperializing 18th century. Homo sapiens, the human species, the anthropos as the human species, modern man, the inventions of this configuration of time, space, matter that gets called modernity, is that conjuncture of the invention of Homo sapiens sapiens as an object of knowledge and attention as species man and his species acts. Whether one is reading Hegel or Adam Smith or the biologists of the 18th and 19th century, we are inside this configuration. Okay. Okay. Modern man, the humanist species, was a chief product of these knowledge practices. What happens when the best biologies of the 21st century cannot do their job with bounded individuals plus contexts, when organisms plus environments, objects inside containers, or genes plus whatever they need, no longer sustain the overflowing richness of biological knowledge as if they ever did? What happens when organisms plus environments can hardly be remembered for the same reasons that even Western indebted people can no longer figure themselves as individuals and societies of individuals in human-only histories? The question that Niels asked this morning, really. Surely such a transformative time on Earth must not be named the Anthropocene. Okay? Now, I'm the sort of girl who, instead of throwing anything out, just adds to the litter. Okay? So I actually think that the term Anthropocene is necessary and useful for many reasons, no matter how much I wish another term had been proposed to deal with the urgencies of situated human beings inducing of extraordinary realities and threats of exterminations, genocides, and extinctions, and flipped out ecosystems and slimy mats where biodiverse possibilities of life, ways human and non-human, have prevailed for long periods of time. I am angry at the notion that this is taken as a species act, as opposed to a situated historical production of a few hundred years, perhaps, with layered, various points of intensity and layering, but not a species act. I wish it had not been named that way, but it is being named that way, and I've never been a purifier. Okay? I'm going to propose to us that if we did have to settle for a single name, I would greatly prefer the Capitalocene, a name proposed by a graduate student at Lund in 2009, Andreas Malm, at which a US visitor, Jason Moore, a Marxist sociologist and political economist, became very interested in Andreas Malm's proposal of a Capitalocene. And Jason Moore, who is the head of the World Ecology Research Network, a grouping of mostly young scholars who are very interested in the historical metabolisms that make ways of living and dying, both human and non-human. It's a kind of multi-species Marxism. As there's a kind of multi-species anthropology among us that's ragged and odd and self-contradictory and stumbling in interesting ways, making a lot of interesting mistakes. And remember that Bruno Latour defined the laboratory as that invention, that technology that allows us to make interesting mistakes as fast as possible. Making mistakes is, of course, always easy. Making interesting mistakes takes skill. I think multi-species anthropology, multi-species Marxism invites interesting mistakes, those that enroll us in these contact zones, the inter-essays that Michel Callon talked about now already many years ago. I thought I had independently invented the term Capitalocene because it seems necessary. Anything you think you have independently invented, just remember the bacteria. And you will understand that they probably did it first in an ongoing way, and most certainly some other human being whom you probably know with 1 degree of separation, you know, who maybe is your cousin's lover or your former graduate student's colleague or something. You know, very few degrees of separation. You will find multiple proposals of terminology that I think are reflections of the shared urgency of our historical conjuncture and that kind of felt lust to propose a kind of felt-in-the-mouth sort of language to approximate some sense of what it is that we're living with and through. Okay? I think Capitalocene is one of those words. Now, Chthulucene is not yet widespread. But I hope that there is a sort of a kind of fertilization moment going on here. Think of me as a dandelion blowing seedy infective vectors across the room, and you are, really receptive soil for dandelions. I'm particularly interested in spreading dandelions these days because I have chickens who really, really, really like to eat dandelions. So I go around with a bucket in my neighborhood and a flashlight at night, and I steal dandelions from my neighbors' yards. So if you hear about an old lady arrested for stalking dandelions in Santa Cruz, which is anyway, point being, Anne-Marie, this is partly for you with the appreciation of eating. Chthulucene, the Greek term thonios, Thulu, dreadful, of and under the earth, those who are of and under Gaia, Terra, prior to Gaia, Terra, much older than the cleaned up, way older and bigger than the cleaned up genealogies of the sort of Bronze Age and late Bronze Age. The dreadful tentacular ones, dreadful perhaps in the sense of awful rather than terrifying, but also terrifying, never safe, in no one's back pocket. Absolutely not your mother. This is not a Mother Earth image. This is rather an image of entities that have tentacles where men might have beards. This is trouble, okay? But it's, I hope, interesting trouble. You may know the science fiction writer Lovecraft, who wrote the Cthulhu series some years ago. That is not my inspiration for the Chthulucene. His Cthulhu was terrifying in the patriarchal mode. I would like cumulatively to accrue resonances through this talk so that the Chthulucene is awful and inviting in quite other modalities than the patriarchal demon monster of Lovecraft. And the Chthulucene, in its ongoing present tense thickness, remember, kainos, the root for scene, C-E-N-E, Holocene, Chthulucene, Pleistocene, blah, blah, scene, the time of the thick present, the time of the thick now, the time of the enduring ongoing, the scene, the kainos, okay? The time of the ongoing thready, tentacular ones, the linear and mycelial ones, the time of the tangled ones, the ongoing thickness of the Chthulucene, which is dreadful in many ways. Again, this is not Mother Earth, nor is it the enemy. It doesn't break down into good, bad, friend, enemy. It breaks down into what will be ongoing and how, who will live and die and how within the mesh of the Chthulucene. And how might the Chthulucene be in friction, in Anna Tsing's sense, in a kind of generative tension with the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene. And last night at dinner, I understood that the Capitalocene must be renamed as the Plantationocene. That it is indeed the invention of the plantation, not the configurations of the circulation of capital, although of course they're tightly linked and coupled, but the moving of, shall we say, genomes around planet Earth, the transportation of people, plants, and animals, trees and tubers, microbes, and the trade routes involved in that, the systems of slavery in particular, the systems of indenture and slavery, the ways that plantation systems, unlike gardens and spit and plots and many kinds of agriculture, plantations require a labor from elsewhere, because what precisely needs to be broken is hefting, the attachment to place. Precisely what's broken in the Plantationocene is love of place, the possibility of the love of place. And Anna taught me that by talking about sugar, the many varieties of sugar in her experience in Indonesia as an ethnographer, and the radical reduction of sugar and sugar plantation slave-based agriculture, and the importation of the technology from Brazil into the Caribbean to remake the world through sweetness. The Plantationocene probably does a much better job of collecting up in a net bag the complexity of what we are living through than either Anthropocene or Capitalocene can do. That said, somewhere in here I have the slide projector control because Elaine Gann gave it to me. Bless her heart. Okay. By the way, the critter that is my icon for the talk is the Pacific day octopus, an unbelievably gorgeous creature. Okay. Now, I am giving this talk in the company of mushrooms, and there are two configurations of mushroom people in my talk. And the first is the Matsutake World's research group, and Anna Tsing's evident joy in the collecting of mushrooms in this field that has been the subject of fire. It's the risk-taking mushrooms who come into a scene after trauma, and Anna's commitment to telling contaminated stories in contaminated times for opening up the possibilities of imagining and effecting ongoingness, and being for some worlds, not others, being for and with situated peoples and unpeoples, and the ways that the really courageous Matsutake mushrooms give Anna a kind of courage. Anna and her research colleagues, many of whom are in this room. Now, my second grouping for giving some sense of the holobiome within which this talk is given, the Matsutake World's Research Network is, in my view, a holobiome. It's full of holobionts in the sense that Scott outlined this morning, and in addition, it forms a holobiome of a multi-taxonomic kind, including people and unpeople, and within which the mycelial mushrooms are perhaps the chief mover and shaker of planet Earth. They are the threads of the Chthulucene in that story. The other mushroom-associated worlding that I propose to you in animating my talk is one you can hear about in more detail tomorrow, and which I learned about only, 2 or 3 weeks ago, when a paper came out from Michael Poulsen and Haraway's collaboration on a particular Sympoiesis symbiogenetic holobiont formation event that involves the macrotermes, those really amazing, very big macrotermes, termite mounds that are full of the Termatomyces fungi mushrooms, and also the termite got full of very specific microbiomes of bacteria, which are really essential to keeping the fungi in this symbiosis from being infected by other fungi that would truly screw it up. The whole thing taken together, the termites, the Termatomyces mushrooms, and the bacteria form a kind of a gigantic digestive system in particular sorts of habitats that cross Africa and Southeast Asia. A huge band that, again, we will hear more about tomorrow. But watch what I've done already in terms of the symbioses of the Sympoiesis players in the holobiome of a person who is trying to inhabit the Chthulucene. I began with a science writer, Ed Young. I begin with the really interesting, innovative, web-based science writing going on among us. And the half dozen or so science writers I read with breakfast, I eat. The half dozen or so science writers like Virginia Hughes and Ed Young and Carl Zimmer and a few others who are taking up the stories. These are science writers who themselves are in love with the living world and in terror of what is happening on the urgencies that infuse all of us, who are writing amazing stuff, bringing it to new publics and large publics, as well as old publics. Okay? I think of the science writers as a critical part of our holobiome. I think of the scientists as a critical part of our holobiome, and I mentioned the collaboration between the laboratory in Copenhagen on the one hand and the genomics and metagenomic capacity, sequencing capacities of the former Beijing Genomics Institute, now BGI Shenzhen, which I learn is which I know because I belong to the Science and Justice Research Network at UC Santa Cruz, is very closely involved with my colleagues in Santa Cruz in the biomolecular engineering and science and justice groups around the 10K project to sequence 10,000 best we can do it, full copies of different mammalian species and archive them effectively in a commons as much as possible. And that BGI Shenzhen is a big player and indeed took on the first 100 species of sequencing obligations in this global collaboration that is made global by the alliance making of the people who were doing the work. On, it must be said, a shoestring, almost unfunded. Depending on the largesse of the institutions for whom this is not their priority. For one thing, it's not medically interesting. Well, it is medically interesting, but you can see what I mean. It's the sciences that get done on a shoestring because people are in love with the project. Okay? Now, I knew about the science writer folks and the scientist folks and the instrumentation and the institutions, all of which are part of a biome, in my sense, or a kind of sympoetic entity, sim-making, becoming with. What I actually hadn't known until I gave the paper to a friend, Leslie Stern, who, actually I gave Poulsen et al.'s paper to Leslie Stern, who is a South African, actually Southern Zimbabwe by birth and rearing, writer in Los Angeles, just an extraordinary writer with whom Anna and I and Katie Stewart and Susan Harding and others are in a worlding writing group. And Leslie said, she said immediately this, she sent back an email. I have also eaten the mushrooms that grow sometimes in these mounds, though only as an adult and only once. I can still taste them, one of the most delectable things I have ever eaten. I am sure the Africans on the farm knew how to access these mushrooms, but we white people didn't and didn't bother to learn. When I went to Bulawayo in the early 90s and spent the decade going back and forth, my friend Sakai Holland from Matabele land sent me off to talk to a number of people with long and detailed political and cultural history of the area. Sakai had just become a leader of a breakaway faction of the MDC. She's a warrior. One of them was a white woman, then already old and nearly blind, who had been born to aging parents, and her father had been a translator for Cecil Rhodes. She had worked with rural women's organizations for over 50 years and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the political history of Matabele land. She also spoke Ndebele without an accent, a beautiful click language, but extremely hard for native English speakers to get a handle on. Because she could no longer drive, I was able to drive her truck into the Matapos, an extraordinary, rocky, beautiful, and sacred country. There, she visited friends, peasant farmers, and we were given some of these mushrooms. She said it was rare for white people to know about and certainly to eat these mushrooms. To know about them, when and how to harvest, was a rare knowledge. I felt extremely privileged. The sensory memory of those mushrooms is intertwined with all the stories she told me over those 3 days, and the intertwining of the natural, the sacred, and the cultivation and desecration of spaces. That is also part of the holobiome that I am proposing, the sympoiesis, this entanglement for going on with each other with good heart, and the kinds of things that are hard to see within the collecting net bag called the Anthropocene, but easy to see, I think, within the collecting net bag I am proposing to call the Chthulucene. Okay, this, by the way, this is a string figure, a hyperbolic crocheted jellyfish by a science fiction writer, one of my favorite, named Vonda McIntyre, that you'll hear more about the hyperbolic crochet reef project in a little bit. But for the moment, it's forming a slide background to what I am using as my own kind of collecting net bag, namely the signifier SF. String figure, science fiction, science fact, speculative fabulation, soin de ficelle, speculative feminism, so far. We've gotten so far. And of course, SF Gilbert. who becomes part of the SF. Well, anyway, you've got it. Who needs to say more? I am very serious about proposing SF as a technology to think with in many senses of the term. Partly because the practice of string figure making, the making of patterns, which is a very demanding kind of thing. You must learn how to do it. You must work well with partners, even if the partners are your own two hands, those who have digits. That string figuring or pattern making, the kinds of fiber arts of pattern making are a good way, I think, to imagine the sorts of entities that Scott was talking about this morning, these relationalities which are highly material. And individuality might be a special case of these relationalities. It's not that you stop talking about this entity called the individual, but it becomes a kind of a special case and a kind of hiving off of certain temporalities and certain spatial relations and certain sorts of socialities in order to propose the individual as a terribly important matter. For example, a terribly important matter in international human rights courts, one that I dare us to do without, even knowing how contaminated it is, okay? Even knowing how much bad work it also does on the planet. I think string figuring allows us to drop the binary habits of thought and instead try to think about what kind of pattern making is going on. And it insists that we also pay attention to action and passion, holding still and moving, that in order to make a pattern, Isabel Stenger's pointed out, something has to hold still for something else to move, and then back and forth, back and forth. And we can think of the Chthulucene, or the Plantationocene, or the Anthropocene as an instance of a quite important proposition that Isabel made from Felix Guattari as her informant, her sympoietic partner, namely, whether you asked for it or not, the pattern is now in your hands. What are you going to do with it? How do we inherit? It makes no difference whether we are guilty of this, that, or the other thing. Truly doesn't matter, asked for or not, the pattern is now in our hands, and living and dying on this earth is at stake in ways where what we do with these threads matters, maybe only a little bit. But this is a way of thinking about engagement in this case, knowledge making, that's quite different from worrying about objectivity or subjectivity, terms that don't interest me very much, or bias or non-bias. Those are important terms in some contexts, for sure. But I'm proposing that much richer figures for knowledge making have to do with detachment and attachment, composition and decomposition, recomposing, decomposing. And I think of myself, and I hope you, as compost-ist, as involved in compost, not posthumanism. I am a compost-ist, not a posthumanist. Okay? I'm not interested in post, in that sense, anything. And we practice the humanities, not the humanities, H-U-M-U-S. Same root as homo, but it does other work. Okay? The humanities don't start with the premise of the division between the natural sciences and the humanities. That might be a locally interesting phenomenon that does great harm and sometimes some good. But you don't start with the premise of the split. You start with the premise of the compost pile and turning it well. Okay? The kind of care of the compost, turning it well. So, think we must. Virginia Woolf's phrase, and I've used this. I think we live in a time where the requirement of thinking has never been more urgent. Hannah Arendt defined thinking as training the mind to go visiting. Okay? This sort of moving out, the kind of moving along lines, training the mind to go visiting. Marilyn Strathern, with her with her phrase in 1992, Reproducing the Future, says, "It matters which ideas we use to think other ideas with." She sets me off in a kind of jazz riff from there. It matters what stories tell stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what worlds world worlds. It matters what matters matters. The kinds of recursions that focus our attention in very interesting ways. And I would like to say something in relation to this By the way, the background slide there is a Cat's Cradle series by the really interesting Jewish artist Viola Goldenthal, who died a couple of years ago and who had trained in the Kabbalah and was really interested in Cat's Cradle in that context. But remember, we had this discussion this morning about the question of the individual and why it was perceived as so exciting to propose that we have never been individuals. Well, the straightforward answer to that is because of the trouble the bounded individual and methodological individualism as a philosophical apparatus has caused in the world, in systems of law, systems of politics, systems of landholding and legal title. On and on we go. We understand that the degree to which the planet we live on has been worlded within the premises of bounded and methodological individualism, and that the individual as a notion of the bounded unit has been exceedingly powerful, sometimes for the good, but in any case, it has worlded the world to an extraordinary degree, such that people like us find detailed and technically precise and exuberant and in generative ways to think otherwise, to open wedges into possibility. It's not like it's a situated excitement out of peoples who have been trained a certain way, being given an opportunity to do and think otherwise, and foregrounding connectivity and relationality otherwise. But what if the history of biology and politics and land title and so forth and so on had been largely practiced and invented by the peoples of Melanesia, for whom the making of persons is a quite different process that does not work by reproduction, which isn't to say they don't know where babies come from. That's an uninteresting and boring matter within this whole thing. But the making of persons is a practice of composing and decomposing certain kinds of relationalities and passages of substance that have, so that the entity like me, who comes out of those processes, is a dividual, the result of the division of various kinds of givers of substance and various kinds of flows of kin and non-kin apparatuses and flows of pigs and potatoes and cars and money and so forth. And dividuality then is, a dividual is a person such as the folks in this room, and it is understood that the making of persons is a process of composition and decomposition. What if those had been the grounding philosophical premises for the invention of land law, for the invention of notions of compensation? For example, the Melanesian that Marilyn Strathern studied in Papua New Guinea and Port Moresby and elsewhere, faced with the timber companies, the logging companies who come into Papua New Guinea for log extraction, those companies are quite interested in having a good legal apparatus for knowing who to pay. So who is the entity, in their view, individual or community or whatever, who is properly compensated? And they want basically to know the source, the entity that has uncomplicated and single title, from whom dependent titles have been broken. They want to know, they want somebody who is not hefted to place. They want somebody for whom the bonds have been broken by and large, and the apparatuses for breaking bonds are numerous. But the Melanesianists are going to be much more interested in finding the hinge. They're way more interested in the elbow as the bodily metaphor for the composition and decomposition of wealth, because they're interested, by and large, in its relays. And if you know that where all the hinges are, you know where compensation is going to have to be directed to keep people from killing each other or bringing each other to court or whatever. That is way more important in compensation agreements to know something about hinging. These have not been the habits of thought and practice that have invented modern biology. We would have a different science. Does that mean the world is different from the way it is? Well, in some non-trivial sense, it does, which isn't to say the world is made up, but it is made in these sympoetic, semiotic, material engagements. These worldings, such as we inhabit the world, are made through these kinds of material semiotic engagements, and they matter. Okay. Now, thinking with the tentacular, I would like to say a little bit more about that. First of all, remember that tentacular, tentaculare, network, means to try, to attempt. The tentacular is reaching out and trying, is attempting, is living along lines. They have, this is the Ood from Planet of the Ood from Doctor Who. The enslavers, the makers of the plantation, separated the external hindbrain of the Ood and replaced them with communicators such that they could be an army slave race and used against other species. The liberator restores the organic connection of the Ood, who then retrieve their symbiotic community with each other and are no longer under the control of the slave maker. I like to think of that as perhaps the latest release of the, the iPhone 5 or 6. But my ungenerous thoughts probably shouldn't be developed. Doctor Who, I suggest, is a much better story cycle to think with than Star Trek ever was, in no small part because of the power of the tentacular ones. Now, I remember, because a person put a book in my hands, that's why I remember, that in the Bronze Age thinkers who give rise to the Mediterranean worlds, including the Greeks, regarded cuttlefish, octopuses, and squid as really, really potent entities, really, really interesting because of their polymorphory, their ability to shapeshift their bodies. Anybody who's tried to keep an octopus in a tank knows that the octopus can slip through and get on your lab floor and then climb up and go into another tank. The polymorphory of these guys is really interesting. The fact that they form mesh knot networks with their tentacles is really interesting. And the fact that they squirt inky night, that they squirt darkest night with their ink out of an odd part of their bodies that doesn't correspond easily to our own. Watch the way that popular culture makes octopuses. First of all, they always make them with round eyes, which is really odd because they don't have round eyes. And what counts as the top and the bottom and the head and the tail, these questions of polarity are really confusing when one's looking at the cephalopods, these sort of twisted up mollusks with little shelly bits inside themselves. They squirt darkest night. They are indeed, for the Greeks, the figure of aporia, that which, the limits of knowledge, the limits of what can be known and controlled. The squirting of darkest night, the swirling clouds of darkness that are the Chthulucene, as well as, the Chthulucene must include the swirling clouds of darkest night. In a way, the Anthropocene, the Anthropos is the one who looks up, or the one who always looks up. Etymologically, it's the one who looks up. No wonder he trips all the time. The stargazer, for whom gravity is a serious problem, for whom first birth is a mess and second birth into the stars, even if you fall back to Earth and crash in some sort of secular, quasi-sacred, tragic detumescence is not the problem. The Anthropos is always the one who looks up. Not so the tentacular ones, which is one of the many reasons I love them. So Tim Ingold, in that beautiful book about lines, tells us that life is lived along lines, not at points. And this quite beautiful painting, contemporary painting by Carlos Amorales, is simply a reminder of what I've already been saying. Ursula Le Guin gives me another critical methodological apparatus for proposing the notion of the Chthulucene to collect up our urgencies, and that is the carrier bag theory of fiction. That it is the collecting from the world, the small kinds of things that can be proposed or shared or taken. It's the tiny negative spaces. She's very interested as a Taoist and an anarchist in negative spaces. A person for whom indigenous America, anarchism, and Taoism are the three major streams of her thinking and writing. Ursula Le Guin, in the carrier bag theory of fiction, proposes a theory of narrative to feminists that was taken up in the early 1980s and transformed many of us. Okay? She has this figure in her book, Always Coming Home, for the Kesh people, and I think it's a beautiful illustration of a riverine world and life lived along lines. And I propose that one remembers our visitor who was studying the riverine Sarawak, Anna Noboru Ishikawa, that this is a kind of a resonance image with the way he is studying the world in Sarawak. Now, Jim Clifford, colleague of Anna and me, who many of you have probably also read, argues this: we need big enough stories. Okay? He is not interested in opposing the big and the little, you know, the local and the global, the whatever and the whatever. He's truly not interested in these kinds of binary moves. And he is committed to the notion of big enough stories, which is a pragmatic question. For what? Who lives and dies inside of which stories? How does it matter if I tell the story of, let's say, forest cutting in Papua New Guinea through the individuality of the local Melanesians, or through the land title law of the international courts that is rooted in English, in John Locke mainly, and rooted in Roman and English law? How does it matter which stories I use to tell stories through and with? Well, it matters fundamentally. And Jim says, I think of these as big enough histories, able to account for a lot, but not for everything, and without guarantees of political virtue. Rejecting one big synthetic account or theory, I say, Clifford works to craft a realism that, quote, works with open-ended because their linear historical time is ontologically unfinished. This is not against linear anything, okay? But unfinished, big enough stories, sites of contact, struggle, dialogue, where ongoingness is at risk, okay, at stake. Now, if one turns again to the Anthropocene, my bête noire, although that's an insult to bet, you know, really, this is not fair either. The guys who proposed the Anthropocene are good guys. I mean, after all, it was a really neat person, Eugene Sturmer, who studied freshwater diatoms in the Great Lakes in the northern United States, who was deeply, profoundly worried about the growing evidence for the ruination of the coral ecosystems by acidification and heating, and who teams up with the atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, Nobel Prize winner, to propagandize, in the very best sense of the word propaganda, to propagandize and popularize and further develop the scientific apparatus for this thing called the Anthropocene, to call our attention to the fact that what is happening on the Earth in the airs, waters, and places in the lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, whoozy wet sphere is profoundly impacted by the metabolism of people with the Earth in system destabilizing ways. How could one be against these folks? Okay. Now, I propose this picture for the Anthropocene as not so much one who looks up as one who, I don't know, is the Earth down from the moon? I'm not sure. But this is a picture of the Earth within the space projects of the Cold War, which is absolutely fundamental to the development of the theories of autopoiesis. Lynn Margulis knew this. Absolutely fundamental to the development of the theory of the Anthropocene, and indeed what we understand as complex systems theories, generally deeply embedded in the apparatus and in cognitive and material of military and space technology, which doesn't make it bad, it situates it, okay? But Gaia, as seen from out there, is the Gaia of the Anthropocene. It's not an Earth Mother any more than the Chthulucene is, okay? Gaia is not an Earth Mother in this. Rather, it is that which, in Isabel Stenger's term, that which intrudes, systems, partially coupled, multiple systems that can be made to fail, that can accept and absorb insult after insult after insult in quasi-homeostatic adjustment until it doesn't, until you get a flip reaction, either in small areas or immense areas. Gaia is not an Earth Mother, but the terrifying Earth as system, which I think is a very potent and powerful idea. Lovelock gave lectures on Gaia, the Earth system, over a number of years, and this comes from the archive, which is one of the early diagrams that juxtaposes the circuitry of electronics with the circuitry of the system. Anybody who knows anything about the history of ecosystems knows how important the Odom brothers were to doing systems theory, ecological systems theory, as a problem in electronics, basically, as electrical wiring. And that these kinds of diagrams are not merely representations. They are rather working models of the world as it is lived. They are not examples, but models, I suggest. Climate Change 2007, it's another working of the iconography of the Anthropocene. This one is from the Burning Man Festival. The Anthropocene, crudely put, is that time-space of the world in which fossil-making man tries to make new fossils as fast as possible by burning old fossils. Okay? So it's very definitely a fossil era, or fossil epoch, you know. And fossil-making man seems to me best represented by this sort of cruciform burning man at this commercial anarchist festival in the Nevada desert, the Burning Man Festival. The reason I say commercial anarchist is you can't take or show this photograph legally, because every photograph you take at the festival, even with your little camera, is owned by the Burning Man Festival, and you sign an agreement to that effect when you go to the festival. This is an anarchist festival that grows out of the summer solstice celebrations in San Francisco, right? And the first Burning Man festivals in San Francisco have this kind of 12-foot-high wooden human figure and a little wooden dog, and they're all burned in this great festival of the summer solstice. It becomes this 120-foot-high man without a dog, copyrighted. This is supersizing, supersizing the figure of the Anthropos, fossil-making man burning fossils, which of course brings us back to the Capitalocene, and I will move fast because I've already said this. If we think of the Capitalocene as beginning in the mid-18th century with the invention of that mutation of modernity, it's not exactly wrong, but it makes some unfortunate errors, including failing to remember the circulations of substance and money, the circulations that I just quickly allude to in the Indian Ocean trade of the 12th through the 16th centuries, or allude to by reminding us again of the notion of the Plantationocene. I'm not going back to the end of the Pleistocene. I'm not going to a species act with man the hunter. I'm not talking about the human species as necessarily the Earth's destroyer in his grand tragic end of things. I'm talking about situated historical formations that are extremely real. The Capitalocene's current globalizations are working such things as the opening up in the Northwest Passage through the warming of the oceans, such that the ice lock in the summer in the Northwest Passage has already loosened, such that a Japanese-built, Danish-owned ship carrying heavy coking oil in the summer of 2013 made a passage that the climate modelers actually thought was not going to be possible for another 40 years, but in fact occurred in the year 2013. We're looking at a military icebreaker. We're looking at the entrapped ships looking for the Northwest Passage in the 19th century, and remembering that the passage opened just summer and a half ago. And we're looking at Greenpeace trying to board a Soviet oil rig. We're remembering that all of the circumpolar major countries, most certainly including the Nordic countries, are deploying new kinds of military machinery and strategic planning around the circumpolar north because the energy stakes are immense. The energy reserves in the province of Alberta are matched only by Saudi Arabia's, and these are heavy tar sand oils involving a kind of water pollution that is almost the creation of a new Great Lakes zone in the northern part of Canada. The name of the game of the Capitalocene or the Anthropocene, the stakes in that game are very high. Scott spent a good lot of time this morning talking about the sciences of the modern evolutionary synthesis, which made the configuration of knowledge in the Anthropocene possible, but at the same time also destroys its own conditions of gestation, if you will. The Anthropocene, I think, depends on a kind of systems theory that breaks down notions of bounded individuals related by competition equations. But the sciences of the modern synthesis, very powerful sciences, depended on notions of units and relations whose working with such skillful and successful ways basically creates the conditions of its own surpassing, not ending, but surpassing, doing otherwise. In anthropology, one could say that the height of the Anthropocene sciences really was man a course of study. I get this from Susan Harding. Result of 4 fields anthropology. It was a grade school curriculum that integrated the ethology of salmon salmon and seagulls and baboons, and the Netsilik, then called Eskimo, the Netsilik Inuit, and contemporary human beings in this marvelous school for curriculum for primary children that came out in 1970, where man was the apex species in this multi-species story within the modern synthesis. And this program was so controversial that US Christians killed it fast. It was removed from the curriculum in a real hurry and has been replaced by nothing. It was one of the Science Wars events. It's one of the precursors to the science wars of the kind that attacked both Scott and me as anti-science, which I find laughable, except it isn't. It was a precursor to the science wars that erupted more fiercely in science studies a few years later. And I'm suggesting that now the kind of odd analog to man, a course of study, is sort of octopoi Wall Street. We are the 97%. Invertebrates are 97% of animal diversity. Human beings are part of the story, but tentacularity is really the name of the game. That is more than a joke to put the octopoi Wall Street cartoon there opposite man, a course of study. Though I'm not quite sure how to elaborate the joke. But this slide is to remind us that the octopus is, again, not a symbol. It's not a salvation symbol at all. It's a complex mesh symbol that most of our history has been used to figure the plutocrats, the big capitalists, the gobbler-uppers of small people, the Stanford oil conglomerates, the Rockefellers, the Hearst newspaper conglomerates, and that this is a cartoon from the early 20th century, the devilfish of California politics, that has the octopus of big money, big plutocracy, swallowing up all of the small people, certainly including labor unions, although World War II and Kaiser and the shipyard unions, never mind, there are many stories to be told. Now, to go to the Chthulucene again, I want to propose that we are talking about an extended period of time that I would like to propose one starting point with this terracotta, 6th century before the current era, in Rhodes, probably, that has a depiction of a very old figure, Potnia Theron, the mistress of animals, who, as you can tell from the drawing, is also the mistress of bees. She's a bee figure. Look at her wings. She's a bee. She's the mistress of animals, the mistress of bees, a very important phonic figure who is still ritually engaged with today in various kinds of Wiccan rituals. Who find bees terribly important, and engaged by the activist group, the Reverend Billy and his Church of Stop Shopping. The Church of Stop Shopping is the church I'm joining. Reverend Billy, who is a fabulous, he has all of the abilities of the evangelical preacher. He is a genius as an evangelist of the Church of Stop Shopping. The Reverend Billy, who's that guy with the white arms over there, and the choir of the Church of Stop Shopping and other allies have formed a project against the robo-bee of the robotics laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The robo-bee is a project at MIT to develop a bee that can actually pollinate in contemporary industrial agriculture, because real live honeybees are a working class that has been nearly destroyed. Its immunological systems have been broken down. Its hive diseases are epidemic. Its colony failures are legion and well known in the press. Bees that are moved from monocrop to monocrop to monocrop to monocrop end up with, as you would understand from Scott's lecture, serious microbial problems in their guts, with serious implications for their behavior, their longevity, their reproduction, their ability to go on. Real live honeybees are under astonishing assault on this planet. This is news to none of us. MIT is, of course, attempting to develop a robo-bee. And the Honeybeelujah project that exorcises the robo-bee from the MIT laboratories is a wonderful instance of anarchist activism of the moment that I think of as one of the art activisms of the Chthulucene. The Chthulucene also has figures that are very troubling. Pachamama is often proposed as a figure to inspire contemporary activism, the figure from the Bolivian mountains, the figure of the peasant and labor struggles, the figure of an earth that resists capital somehow, even in the grip of colonialism and capital. The figure of Pachamama that I propose to you from the, I believe this one comes from the late 16th century, is a Pachamama appropriated to the figure of the Virgin Mary, who is also the mountain, who is the silver mountain, making the king and the pope at the bottom really happy because of all the silver that got out of her. And the, she is the silver mama. Pachamama made into the silver mama. And the next one is a contemporary Pachamama, which is from an internet website selling commercial handicrafts to a world shopping audience. Okay? It's the appropriation of the New Age Pachamama, which is not the one that your colleague from Lund, Anna Kaiser, wrote about, Who Marches with Pachamama, where she's looking at the extremely conflicted and important struggles around whether the Brazilian state or some other configuration or who walks with Pachamama and how. How is that contested in contemporary Bolivia, and so what? And the kind of thing we dare not be ignorant of in thinking that if we adopt the figure of Gaia, the figure of Pachamama, the figure of the Thulu or whatever, we have somehow exited from the trouble. Quite the opposite. It's got to be a way of staying with the trouble. Okay? So if that's 1,000 names in trouble, this is 1,000 names reclaimed, and I'm going to let it go by fast. It's an Australian artist and an Inuit artist from Nunavut, in an area adjacent to or inside of, depending on how you think, Canada. The Nunavut Inuit artist, Kanojuek Ashivak, terribly important in the resurgent indigenous arts movement of Nunavut, and the artist David Malangi, a fundamental Aboriginal thinker, worker, whose paintings are among the documents that established both copyright and successful land claims in Australia. This is an example of one of the drawings that got accepted legally in Australia in land claims courts. Both of these artists, it seems to me, are the kinds of figures that the notion of the Anthropocene makes hard to see, hard to understand as part of our neighbors. Now, this figure that was done in commemoration of the death of Lynn Margulis a couple years ago by the artist Shoshana Dubiner, is 4 by 6 feet high. It hangs between the biological and the geosciences departments at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and it commemorates in a kind of speculative fabulationist way with critters that are recognizable, including part critters like the blue dragon-like figure, which is a phospholipid tubule. So their scale is really played with in this painting. It commemorates Lynn Margulis's theory of symbiogenesis, the making of nucleated cells through essentially bacteria eating each other and getting partial indigestion. The sort of partial inclusion and exclusion of each other that invents something new. The emergence of the modern cell as a symbiogenetic event. I go back to Nicole King's laboratory, as Scott did this morning, with just a slightly different emphasis. The choanoflagellates uninfected live as singletons. The choanoflagellates infected form roseates that are models of animal multicellularity. They look very much like sponges with tissue layers. They act very much like sponges with tissue layers. They are being developed as a model system for the study of the emergence of animal multicellularity. Now watch what's happening. The model systems in the sciences of the modern synthesis, Scott's got a paper on this too, the model organisms for the sciences of the modern synthesis are in a sense individuals. Those organisms whose embryology lends itself to thinking that way, mice, fruit flies, C. elegans nematode worms, a few others, certainly less than a dozen entities that are perfectly good enough individuals for the study of population and other phenomena within the sciences of the modern synthesis, not as examples of some general principle, but as working models, as tools. Like a border collie with a Highland sheepherder, they are both tools and companions, these model systems. What's happening now in creative laboratories around us, the termite, macrotermes, termitomyces, bacteroides, holobiome, sympoiesis, symbiosis, okay, is one example. The Nicole King choanoflagellates and the Margaret McFall-Nye and colleagues' Hawaiian bobtail squid and the Vibrio symbionts that make it possible for the hunting squid to look like the starry night from below to organisms that it is chasing for dinner. So the hunting squid looks like the starry night because of the fluorescing bacteria in the ventral pouch that are only there because the bacteria stimulated the squid. The story Scott told this morning. These are being developed as potentially off-the-shelf model systems that other laboratories can take up to study phenomena that are not studyable by individual organisms. Those kinds of model systems, like, it's not like mice are going to disappear, far from it. I mean, perish the thought. But the kinds of generative invention, crafting of model systems that really weren't available before in such a way as to standardize them well enough that they can be given to colleagues, not exactly as off the shelf, but as quasi-standardized model systems for such basic phenomena as the invention of the cell, the invention of multicellularity, the invention of symbiotic developmental programming, and I would suggest a fourth pattern of behavior, the biobehavioral worldings that I think model systems are yet kind of thin on the ground, but I think being developed as we speak. Natasha Myers at York University in Canada, and her colleague Carla Hustak, using the ant-wasp symbiosis that Scott also talked about, the ways that the genitals of the orchid mimic the female genitals of the partner the male wasp or bee would be seeking, so a kind of bringing in of the pollinator through a kind of sexual jouissance that some biologists call trickery. Carla Myers and Hustak talk about involutionary momentum as a kind of basic property of what used to be called protoplasm. A basic property of living substance is their chemosensory awareness of each other, both in repulsion and attraction. And that it is the foundation, that is the material semiosis that is the foundation of that mode of material communication we call biology. And then involutionary momentum is what makes evolutionary selection possible. Okay? So they use these kinds of symbioses to say that. So let me read for you the cartoon that I don't think you can read, which talks about the question of memory and inheritance within this framework. Here's the stick figures. There are these orchids whose flowers look like female bees. When males try to mate with them, they transfer pollen. This orchid, Ophiuchus apifera, which I think I mispronounced, makes flowers, but no bees ever land on them, because the bee it mimics went extinct long ago. Without its partner, the orchid has resorted to self-pollinating, a last-ditch genetic strategy that only delays the inevitable. Nothing of the bee remains, but we know the bee existed from the shape of the flower. It's an idea of what the female bee looked like to the male bee as interpreted by a plant. Wow. The only memory of the bee is a painting by a dying flower. I'll remember your bee, orchid. I'll remember you. That cartoon, I think, captures the kind of felt worlding that we're proposing to you. And I would like to suggest that what's proposed and made available in this world is not some list of responsibilities that belong to individuals or to societies, but rather the cultivating of the capacity of response ability. That what the entities of the entangled ones in string figuring do with and for each other is cultivate the capacity to respond, both old kinds and new kinds. There's no particular privilege to the new, although some new things do need to be invented. But the cultivating of the capacity of response is quite a different notion from responsibilities for which we can make a list if we truly understood what was going on. It's the sense that the cultivation of the capacity to respond has to be made sympoetically through living and dying with each other on this earth in many kinds of time-space configurations. We are all lichens. Erase the now, it's wrong. Okay? Eco, evo, devo, histo, techno, psycho. It's obvious. Okay. I've been following many art activism, art science activist projects. Art, science, activist, all three words are really important. I think the Robo-Bee exorcism is a kind of art science activist project. But the crochet coral reef interests me in a particular way, among other things, because it's a fiber art practice developed by Margaret and Christine Wertheim, twins, as you can plainly see. Okay. One of whom is a mathematician, the other of whom is a comp lit person by training. And the mathematician one came to be aware of the work by the Latvian mathematician at Cornell, a woman named Taimina, never mind, wrong, who proposes a mathematical model for hyperbolic forms in crocheting. And they become an important part of mathematical research. The Wertheim sisters take up these hyperbolic crochet objects, which of course are very useful for modeling coral reefs, and develop a kind of symbiosis, sympoiesis in, to date, more than 7,000 people in more than 27 countries, making satellite reefs with each other as a way of bringing together care for the reef, mathematics, women's fiber arts, the inclusion into the community of people who are non-women as well as non-mammals, the kind of intimacy without proximity, a cultivation of the capacity to respond to the coral reef world without having to go there and touch them and kill somebody. So it's what Jake Metcalf calls intimacy without proximity, the cultivation of the capacity of intimacy without proximity as a responsibility. And the Crochet Coral Reef Project is being done all over the world by people who get together and crochet both mimetic and fabulated coral reefs. And they do much of their work with collected trash. The bleached coral reef, there, the white one, the toxic coral reef made with all plastic, the rule that some of these reefs can only be collected by trash waste bags, and the coral reefs that are made out of waste plastic are allowed to go on indefinitely, where other kinds of coral reefs come to an end. There's a sort of building in of conditions of making that in some sense mimic the endless trashing, plastic trashing of the oceans. The beauty of the coral reef. Okay, so there's the fiber arts. Then I would like to propose the making of books for children. Beatrice Potter's rabbits were the main form of natural history in the Malagasy Republic for Malagasy children that my colleague and fellow graduate student at Yale, Alison Jolly, a lemur biologist, arrives on Madagascar in the Malagasy Republic and is presented with a fact that the kids in those schools in the Malagasy Republic know the Beatrice Potter rabbits, but don't have the slightest idea what a lemur is. Okay? Over a period of years, she and her Malagasy colleague produce a series of beautiful bilingual children's books in both Malagasy and English, and now also in Chinese and several other languages, multilingual children's books with real dramatic stories of six of the lemur species of Madagascar that are real ecological stories. They really situate the young lemurs in ecologically plausible, speculatively fabulated worldings in these absolutely gorgeous books. The Pigeon Blog Project, the acoustic ecology, the guy, David Dunn, who modifies sound transducers to put into pine trees to listen to the soundscape of the bark beetles and to produce a kind of music that I've played for my students in class and the sound of light in trees that he also proposes as a kind of sonic scape that teaches us a great deal about the importance of sound and the biosociology of the bark beetles, about the holobiome of this disease symbiosis, because this is the invasion by the pine beetles of the pine trees across North America, the utter devastation of forests. This is a disease symbiosis of strange and eerie beauty made available to us by a musician working with digital and sound technology in acoustic ecology, also proposing modes of biocontrol through sound rather than through spraying and such like, interrupting the sound ecology of the holobiome. Rothenberg puts a hydrophone into the water and records the sounds of humpback whales and plays his jazz clarinet back to them, and composes essentially multi-ets or duets, not just duets, composes a kind of acoustic ecological music to foreground the question, is this call and response jazz? What is going on in this inappropriate cross-species matter? I end with a picture for the children of compost, a quilt based on lichens that won a prize in a fiber arts show that my sister-in-law, Roberta, put me onto because she's heavy into quilting. The Children of Compost is a whole story cycle I'm trying to tell with a couple of colleagues whose main point is make kin, not babies. But I don't have time to tell those stories now, so I will simply end the lecture. Thank you.
Okay, lots and lots of things. Holy mackerel. Yeah, I was thinking about the demons of the dark, the awful, terrifying, awesome chthonic deities, the chthonic monsters. You know, this calls to mind things like Godzilla. Godzilla is awakened by the atomic bomb. Also, you know, unleash the Kraken. Okay, the Kraken has to be unleashed. It's not there. It's not ready to walk about. No, you unleash it. So what is this unleashing of the Chthulucene? What gets this new mode of you take this off. Well, actually, I'll go over to it. I was at one time thinking that I'd have something to say in terms of narrative. But okay, here's Godzilla. Okay, he is awakened. He's awakened by the atomic bomb. These are things by Christensen, a wonderful contemporary print artist concerning the obscenity of the atomic bomb and also the waking up of Godzilla. And here, of course, is the Kraken. Okay, what causes the awakening of the Chthulucene and this notion of you know, this new world, this new discovery of the importance of relationships over substance, this notion of, you know, symbiopoiesis. And I think what you get is that it is due to the catastrophic failure of one of the big stories, and that was the Human Genome Project was going to find out who we are. The Delphix quest is going to be solved by the science of genetics. And I have something, well, this is just a picture. The next picture is the pleasures of Cthulhu. And this is over here, Metamorphosis, done by Douglas DeVivo. And this is just a mandala. You could look and meditate on this. And this is kind of all these interactions going on, including commercial interactions. And I think one of the things that caused this is the failure of the quest for the humans through the human genome. But what I think is so incredible is that you can only get to this holistic, this interactive view of biology through the most analytical techniques we have, PCR, high-throughput RNA analysis, high-throughput sequencing. It's really amazing. We didn't know the species existed until PCR. We didn't know their interactions until high-throughput RNA sequencing. Just amazing. And I think it was kind of when we realized that this is not telling us, you know, be careful what you ask for. We want to know who we are. We came up with a totally new paradigm. And I think this gets into the Chthulucene. And what I want to ask, because I think it's so critical for what you were talking about, is storytelling modes in Anthropocene, Plantationocene, Chthulucene. And by the narrative mode, what I want to know is, first, are these limiting the type of story being told? Are these filtering, you could tell these stories but not these stories? And are these different ways of thinking, as you said, thinking about the thinking that thinks the world, or worlding the worldings that world the world. What I want to know is also, does this not only affect the type of story being told, but the story itself, the parts that you're allowed to tell and what things go together? And third, what is the appropriate genre? The genre of the Anthropocene seems to have been, in the last 200 years, kind of epic narrative. That we're telling this epic. Is that appropriate for the for Chthulucene, Plantationocene? What would be the mode of storytelling that you would consider, one of the, would be featured or highlighted by these different ways of saying the next generation?
I think the part of my talk I care most about really is the insistence that it matters which stories tell stories, and that stories reach into and change each other in their telling, and that telling more than one at a time with and through each other is a way of becoming attuned to stories no one yet knows how to tell, as well as attuned to remembering stories that perhaps have been suppressed, maybe actively, maybe passively, or forgotten, or lost, or perhaps are there but fringy and marginal, that move in location. That storytelling practices, which are multi-generic, I think storytelling practices, and I'll turn to that question of genre in just a minute, but I think everything I've said could be reduced to the premise that it matters which stories tell stories, and that in the very process of doing string figuring with them, they do reach into each other and propose other sorts of attunement, other sorts of patterning, that they become at risk to each other. So that if I tell the story of the Anthropocene, whose major genre I think is maybe double, perhaps the epic, and I actually also think international policy making, the scale of the international meeting. I think the genre of the Anthropocene is the policy-making scale, the scale of the global modelers. I think the generic practices of storytelling in the Anthropocene are overwhelmingly the global modelers, which is one of the reasons I break out in hives. Now, obviously, there are many others, the performance artists, folks like ourselves, so forth. So I think of what you do as a highly, a very outreaching, but a highly, the kind of storytelling that you do could not be done without high throughput sequencing apparatuses, without the visualizing apparatuses that make possible showing the bioluminescence of the Hawaiian bobtail squid infected by its vibrio in that amazing scanning electron microscope with its the kinds of immunofluorescence, the kind of very specific active site immune binding with fluorescent emitters. The apparatus of technoscience is not just a precondition, it is part of the storytelling apparatus of the Chthulucene and of Sympoiesis and of symbiogenetic worlding. So far from being the enemy, understanding how to inhabit and taste and how to become response-able with, for, and against these apparatuses and tell their multiple stories of emergence, both in military technology and elsewhere. And so yes, the stories change each other, and I think the genres are multiple and a question of pragmatics. Which sort of situated storytelling is going on here? And what happens if I take the termite mound and its Bacteroides and Termatomyces critters and put it into a storytelling operation with Leslie Stern and with Ed Jung and with my Chthulucene, a kind of 4-part cat's cradle game. Do they all change each other? Well, yes and no. I think they do. I think that part of me that identifies as a biologist hears the Michael Poulsen et al. Paper. I get it. I actually think I get it better. I think I'm more alert to the details. I think I understand a little bit more what it looks like to have those 3 dishes of, 3 dishes of other fungi that are excluded by the antibiotic produced by the bacterium. I think there's sorts of cultivation of attunement that go on by stories telling stories. And that it matters to me to listen to the Nunavut Inuit graphic artist, not as an example of primitive art gone global, but as something that interrupts my storytelling practice in ways that the contemporary sound artist, Tanya Takuk, will make obvious in her extraordinary new music album, Animism, which is sort of hitting the music scene big time, her wearing her seal bracelets. I'm really interested in the way stories interrupt each other to make something else possible.
Thank you so much. Because we've got a big audience and we're running a little late, I wondered if I could propose having a couple questions at a time.
Good idea.
Would that be okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you.
Where are you?
I'm right here.
Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for a great and wonderful and inspiring talk, which perhaps there were also some things I didn't quite get because it was so compact with a lot of very, very good information. But I want to ask you this nonetheless. So I've been attending a lot of projects these last couple of weeks having to do with cultural, social studies of art and the Anthropocene. And for these projects, quite large scale, one of them was Biologies and Globalizations, the Anthropocene monument, the other was Haus Kulturen der Welt, the Anthropocene project. But in all of the different projects, there was an astonishing lack of attention to people outside of a Euro-American context. And it was really, it was quite remarkable actually. So I talked to a friend and colleague who's a professor of anthropology in Japan, and I asked him, so what role does the Anthropocene play in Japan? And he said, none really. And of course they are also very engaged in climate change and issues pertaining to this, but then he said, we are not really the anthropos of the Anthropocene. And what he was referring to was the fact that, so this is of course very specific to Japan, but I think it might also be the case in other places, that in Japan nature has always implied culture, and culture has always implied nature in some kind of way. It has always been more entangled than it has been in the modern, in Europe and America. So I was just wondering, in your notion of the Chthulucene, how would that kind of encompass or engage with this kind of issue?
My name is Johanna Seid. I teach in the philosophy department. I teach in the philosophy department. First of all, wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. Firework of eloquence that one can only be jealous of. My question will sound more hostile than I intended.
Not an opponent.
So I first need to say I'm very sympathetic to the rhetorical gesture of constructivism, of criticism, and so on. If I boil down what you have said to the ontological message, which happens to be my field, then I hear a message that is, even though I come from the analytical philosophy department, or side of philosophy, it is very familiar to me. Mm-hmm. So the fact that we need relational conceptions, that sort of individuality is an illusion, that is something that philosophers have said, at least since Leibniz. Perhaps I would want to say the message might, from my point of view, be more effectively formulated if it's a rejection of particularity, not individuality. There's a notion of individuality that is actually generic, and that makes more sense. But my question is now something like this. I share the urgency. There's a project in philosophy of social robotics that I'm very much involved in. and climate, technological change, and so on. My question is that if we philosophers have not been able to criticize the man of the Enlightenment from within, using the methods, the same methods of the paradigm that we are criticizing, is there any indication that you have that you are a very different style of exposition? The narrative, the associative, the contraposition of the epistemic paradigm and so on, is that ultimately, and I'm speaking very, very practical now, is it more effective?
Let me take these, I actually think these two things are related to each other. I think that what I'm attempting to do is to produce an invitation, a proposal. Will it be taken up? A proposal for other big enough stories that might entangle with each other to produce some kinds of attunement and action other than what we now seem to be capable of, or perhaps what we are inheriting but might make stronger. Okay? So there's no, for example, the Chthulucene is itself another Greek word. It turns on two Greek words. I deliberately partially interrupt that with David Malangi and Kanajuak's different kinds of workings, and with the story of individuality, and with the invitation toward the Malagasy children's books, because I think those are, I brought them into the meshwork of the Chthulucene, but they will escape that network for many sorts of in many sorts of ways that might other sorts of proposals of big enough stories coming from places that people like me barely know how to hear. There may be some kind of transducer going on that foregrounds and prioritizes other kinds of stories, that isn't just yet one more kind of multiculturalist collecting up all the variety, but which stories will shape the parameters for other stories is at stake. And it is partially true, in my view, that Japanese Japanese thinkers and people have not done nature and culture the way Westerners have. But as you know, even putting it that way depends on the prior categories of nature and culture, and does a really odd thing with the Eastern other. And I was listening to the proposal of the humanosphere other than the Anthropocene yesterday, and found it both very interesting and really depressing, both. On all sides. And the part of this is a linguistic problem, is the ability to really care about the materiality of each other's words, if you will, each other's semioses, each other's bacteria coming out of the mouth. The necessity to develop a way more worldly semiotics and attunement to the stories and the terms and the modes of living and dying at stake in them, and who is proposing what where. Now, I actually agree that from a strict philosophical point of view, this is almost a truism within a certain line of philosophical thought. I am an inheritor of Leibniz, Spinoza, Whitehead, Heidegger. Who is surprised? I have a formation in philosophy that has emphasized the problems of ontology and the modes of figuring and configuring relationality. And I use those, I deploy those skills on purpose. And I am not about to disavow my inheritance, even though I know how problematic it is. And I think the notion that I or anyone else is sort of inventing something utterly new is a kind of partial truth and greater arrogance. That I think I'm proposing a configurational kind of work that opens up some things that are perhaps not here yet, or need to be inherited otherwise. It's not the general principle of relationality that somehow is exciting to me, but the devil is in the details. Within which relationalities does who live and die and how? The general principle of relationality as opposed to particularity or the idiom in question, the unitness, the close-bounded particularness. As a general point, one quickly is caught in truisms. The devil in the details of which worldings do which worldings normalize other worldings, and so what? How do we live inside consequences? How do we live, in Hannah Arendt's sense, how do we think? How do we avoid the banality of evil, that is being functionally good at all our skills, but never living inside the consequences of our living this way? Hannah Arendt thought that Eichmann's fundamental lack, though he lacked many things, the fundamental lack was the utter ability to live inside consequences, so that functionality was the sum total of things. It's this play that lowers the temperature on needing to be functional and efficient and right, and lowering the temperature on functionality so as to open up with play the possibility of something else in these urgent times. And I'm willing to inherit everything I've got and everything you've got and a whole lot of things not in this room in order to try to do some good string figuring work.
Yeah, okay, my question is very simple. So I simply didn't get why should the Chthulucene start in 600 BC?
It's not so much that it should start in 600 BC as that where one starts a story is always somewhat arbitrary, okay? But it's not a bad place to start it in the sense that the 600-ish before the current era is a period before the stabilization of the pantheon of the astralized gods and their tame subcommittees. It's before the tamed genealogy of the gods. It's before Gaia becomes the foundation of the Olympiad. It's a time when the making of the earth is a bit more open in terms of who's the foundation of what, and where these figures of the mistress of bees, the mistress of animals, and the metis of the cuttlefish and the octopus and the squid are in play culturally, linguistically, materially. And I really like the idea of sort of aligning with these critters, human and non-human, gods and other, gods is an odd word for the sorts of entities we're talking about, these earth makers. They actually call them gods is a very strange translation, these earth makers. I'm really really interested in doing some string figuring with them to crash the ships on the reefs of, on the Gorgonia, rather than turning the Gorgonia into yet one more dead coral-like reef skeleton, crashed by the latest deep draw petrochemical transport vessel. It's a kind of a proposal of alliance. The western seas of the Mediterranean were the area where the exploring heroes crashed on the reefs. They crashed on the rocks. They were dangerous. They're understood to be dangerous. I really like that. So I was sort of deliberately locating myself in a period of Mesopotamian and Mediterranean history, thinking that this might be a way to crash the ships of the fossil-making man, on living reefs. The Gorgonia aren't exactly coral, but forget that. They're good enough to be coral. Coral-like, the Gorgonians. But anyhow, not a big point. I was doing a kind of a multi-threaded alliance move between the Honeybeelujah people, the mistress of the bees in the MIT labs, and the mistress of the bees in the western seas and Mesopotamia and Mediterranean era of really before 600 BC. It's just this particular terracotta is that old. And the Medusa, who is really one of the figures here, the snaky-faced one, whose face is made of feelers, Tentacular. One of the Olympiad gods had to kill Medusa. And Athena did a murder by hire. Athena, born, without mother from the head of Zeus, does a murder by hire and then puts Medusa's head on her shield, which becomes the shield of the warriors to this day. Okay? The severed Medusa head. But Medusa got her revenge because from her bloody head sprang the Gorgonia, and from her body sprang Pegasus. And I dare you to find a feminist who doesn't love horses, sometimes inappropriately. I am really interested in what might be called mythological storytelling.
The current historical juncture, say,
yes, the sound is, we are unhefted. Go ahead. The sheep are hefted. Go ahead.
We're also in a time of shared urgency, you say, and urgent situations call on two kinds of stories primarily. you know, we've been talking about the millenarian type story. The robo-bee is a kind of a millenarian dream that you can protest against.
But they're actually making this goddamn bee.
I know. It's dreams coming true, or nightmares coming true. But there's also another story in your account here, very complicated and wonderful account, is that of the flower that misses its bee, you know, the apocalyptic story. Now, where do you situate your kind of story between millenarianism and apocalypticism, these two kind of...
I am such a whore. I will use all of the story forms I know how to do, most certainly including those two. I am in a compost pile, not a comp-lit program. No, I'm serious about that. I think millenarian stories are powerful and we'd be foolish to do without them. I'm really not sure that the robo-beast... see, I think that many things to be said. The robo-bee story is very important, a very important provocation at several levels. One of them is to remember how terribly important back engineering is, back design, is in the history of technology, including sensory and war technology from organisms. So that the ability to build nanobots and robo-bees and highly miniaturized entities to do the work of pollination or the work of surveillance and spying or the work of bomb targeting or the work of maybe disease monitoring, or et cetera, and so on. The kind of back engineering from critters is a really, really big deal and remains a really big deal. And it shapes a great deal of our material and intellectual culture. And most of the time, we're sort of unaware of it. And the Honeybeelujah world kind of makes me remember that powerfully. So for me, it's not so much a millenarian story as it is a story about the material conditions of our historical conjuncture that remain highly securitized and highly built on extraction of unsustainable agricultural systems.
Donna, thank you very much. Can I just ask you, when is it good to be quiet?
Well, I always wish for more of it, but I'm clearly not the most skilled at producing it. What do you mean?
I'm sort of serious because the stories pile up on the stories, pile up on the stories. And
How about absence?
I deeply admire it. It does incredible work. Are there moments when the issue is more about creating stories that are just small enough,
not always just big enough.
Or maybe sort of stories that are so small they're simply quiet?
Well, for me, this is a desire as opposed to an achievement. And one of the reasons I evoke Ursula Le Guin and the carrier bag theory of fiction is because of her foregrounding negative space, the hollowed out shell, that which is not filled, leaving unfilled, unsaid, leaving silent. That Ursula Le Guin is many things, including someone who teaches us in the tissue of her stories, her rhetorical apparatus and her storytelling is quiet, actually. And her proposals of negative space and hollowed out things is very serious. And the bioacoustic music, the listening to the bark beetles in the trees, the ability the technical ability even, to make manifest the pauses, I don't know, it seems quiet, quiet is fundamental. So I don't know, I mean, at the level of, put that way, it's a truism, but again, the devil is in the details. Which kinds of silences do what? Okay. That interests me a lot. And in my mode of storytelling, the sort of turning the compost pile is partly a reflection of a rate of metabolism that has a felt need for other folks and non-folks, humans and non-humans, who do the world differently, to be palpably storying otherwise. So I don't think my filling up of things, which is a mode of work, is a drive toward completion, but it's more a drive toward, it's a lusting towards a yearning. I experience it as a yearning. That kind of filling up yearning toward what? Theologically speaking, I've been committed to the, as soon as you propose the name of God, you have committed idolatry. No surprise that in my Catholicism, my theology depended on the negative way of naming. And that once a name is there, always useful, the name has committed you to fundamental not. It's not the minute the name is fixed, the nanosecond the name is fixed, one is engaged in an act of idolatry. And the negative way of naming is the only way of, it's the constant proposal of names to understand their futility. That mode of theology kept me Catholic way longer than it should have. You know? Okay. Where are you? Wave. Ah, thank you.
The interspecies spirit of the day. Let's imagine that you were giving a lecture to a similar crowd of discerning squid or pigs. How would your story change?
Well, part of it would depend on the history of the squid and pigs in question. Pigs are easier, of course, to imagine, to confabulate, to do sympoetic work with. If we're talking about pigs near slaughter in industrial agricultural situations, we're probably talking about profoundly damaged critters in terms of their ability to quietly pay attention to what's going on in their world and respond to it. If we're talking about pigs who have had half a chance at complex biosocial development with other critters, including the workers who handle them and each other, they still might be utterly uninterested in a stranger, but probably quite capable of meeting a stranger over a bit of time, and perhaps the pig and human being in question would do something interesting to the pigs, plural or pig singular, might do something interesting together that both critters find interesting, which you won't know in advance until you propose it and do it. And I've played enough with other critters, granted mostly of the mammalian persuasion, that I know that they propose, and people like me do or don't know how to respond. We're not the only ones who propose. Knowing how to take up a proposal, critters of different taxonomic persuasions can and do read each other's semiotic work. They can and do meta-semiotic work. They can and do make semiotic action in the world that says what is about to happen does not mean what it means. They can do meta-communication. Whether partners can, in fact, pick it up is always a question. And across species difference, communication is possible through the practice of meta-communication, through opening up meanings that aren't yet fixed. I actually do know how to do this with dogs, and I have done it a little bit with chickens, and I've done it a little bit with pigs, but I've never tried to do it myself with squid. But I did inhabit a laboratory at one point that, on a floor that was above some folks who were working with lobsters, and also I have a good friend who works with a particular kind of plesia, the kind of model system, some of whose friends work with squid. And squid, with their neural nets and behavioral complexity and capacities to learn and abilities to engage each other, I know that laboratory people do engage their squid. You know, I don't know how. Is this storytelling? It depends on how strictly one wants to use a term like that. Is this opening up something that Van Saint-Desprez will say, look, it's not so terribly interesting most of the time to ask what a species nature is so that you're capable of A, B, C, and D in advance of an encounter, that socially interacting critters, semiotically interacting critters, make each other capable in the engagement, and they often fail, so that the semiotic work often doesn't succeed. So the interesting question for a squid and human being, for example, in my view, would be what they render each other capable of doing that is not part of their species repertoire in advance, but makes use of the species repertoire, including their prior life experience, that then gets engaged in that encounter. So the history, both a species history of your proteins, if you will, your species history and your that word, your individual history, hey, it's a good use of the word. The history of the critters involved is going to matter in the encounter. But what happens in the encounter is precisely what's open. It is in the open. They are not poor in world. They are rich in the possibility of worlding. And I think squid people can do that kind of thing in labs that I know of, and I'd like to know more details.
This is going to be the last question, unless people have a very urgent thing that you should signal to one of our.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. It was very inspirational. I guess my question is a methodological question, and it's pertaining to this notion of responsibility versus responsibility. And so it's the how. So you're talking about this notion of compostism or entanglement, and so how do you make yourself responsible in this mess?
By jumping into it. I think we are always already multiply engaged, and we need to pay more attention to it, to strengthen some things and weaken others. It seems to me that the only thing that doesn't work is withholding until you know in advance. The only thing that doesn't work is needing to know in advance. That kind of yearning toward each other, that it isn't a particularly humanist thing. It's a humistic thing. Okay, and humans do it, of course, but that kind of yearning toward each other, we build. We're already doing way more than we thought, less than we should. There's already way more happening than we know how to imagine, and less than there should be. Just jump in the compost pile and make mistakes, and preferably interesting ones.
Okay, I have a question up here. All the way up here, I'm Morten from Anthropology. And it's just coming back to what you started out saying regarding the importance of the stories that tell stories. And particularly the thinking through the string patterning, which I find really inspiring and interesting. So how do you actually know that storytelling, takes the form of, is thought through the string patterning? How do we actually know that? Because it seems that, that we keep one thing stable, which is that stories can be or should be or are told through stories. So that we keep that notion steady, right? But is it not also so that that which connects the story and the story for which it's told actually changes?
Yes. These are foreground-background problems. Stories, it matters which stories tell stories, they change each other in the process, but they hold still long enough to be able to engage at all. Stabilities are everywhere in my story. And stabilities have different sorts of temporalities. And it costs something to hold something stable. There's an energetic cost to boundary maintenance. Often it's quantifiable. And the maintaining of boundaries so as to sustain certain kinds of patternings over time is the name of the game of being alive and able to die. So this sort of foregrounding, backgrounding, action, passion, silence, noise, these kinds of pulsations as opposed to binaries. I think that's the way this work goes. And I obviously, as a storyteller, sort of my craft, I hold stories still long enough to engage them in order to produce a proposition of a story that I, anyway, may not have heard before. Have you? And then the so what? Who lives and who dies and how? That way. We must think. Who lives and who dies? What are the consequences? And that is, sometimes we know a whole lot more than we're willing to admit. It's not like we lack knowledge about who lives and who dies inside the plantation of Tsing. The knowledge is abundant. But the ability to take it in and to activate it in our politics, in our literature, the ability to activate what we know is at stake, as well as learning new things. Something like that.
Thank you. That was incredible, and I think demonstrated in the talk itself all of the different kinds of storytelling and components of stories that we're going to have to start bringing together if we want to do the kind of work of undoing some of the 20th century habits that we had in both the humanities and the sciences. So for me, incredibly useful, lots of pieces that we'll hopefully continue to talk about, and we have usefully put up our chance to continue talking about these with a host of really interesting thinkers: Andreas Hegel, Niels Buban, Michael Thomas Poulsen, Peter Funk, Henry Wall. These are all folks that you'll have a chance to hear tomorrow and to continue with Scott and Donna's help in thinking through a kind of world of symbiotic entanglements. Thank you, Donna, and all of you.